For most of us, if we could just act on what we already know about health, finally change those 2 or 3 basic health habits we've been meaning to change, we'd experience a dramatic improvement in overall well being. But knowing what to do and actually doing it are two very different things. We need an approach that supports true personal health transformation. And this is why I launched a new membership based health service called Adapt 180 Health. As a member, you still get answers from licensed functional medicine practitioners and even custom nutrition plans from licensed nutritionists, but it doesn't stop there. You also get your own board certified health coach, an expert in lasting behavior change. Get the support to truly transform your life and unlock more health, joy, and resilience. Visit adapt180health.com. That's adapt180health.com to learn more and download our free ebook. Hey everybody, Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to bring you Tim Kendall as our guest. Tim is the CEO of Moment, an app that helps adults and children use their phones in healthier ways. Tim is the former president of Pinterest. At various points, he led product development, engineering, marketing, and sales. Prior to Pinterest, Tim was Facebook's director of monetization, where he led the development of Facebook's advertising business. Tim serves on the board of UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, where he's recently focused on their mental health strategy. He earned his engineering degree and MBA from Stanford University. You may have seen Tim featured in the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, which explores the wide-ranging impacts of social media and related technologies, and that's what we're going to be discussing on this show. So without further delay, I bring you Tim Kendall. Tim, welcome to the show. I've really been looking forward to this.
Thank you. Yeah, I have too.
I always like to start with a little bit of background. Why don't you tell us how you came to be the CEO of Moment in a nutshell? I know we're gonna touch on a lot of different topics, but you had a number of different positions at Pinterest, and also before that, played a significant role in developing Facebook's monetization and advertising program. So, tell us where this all started for you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it all sort of starts really, I mean, growing up as a kid, I was just fascinated with technology and fascinated with the kind of the underlying science of technology, like what were the things that made it so that technology could do magic things in our lives. And even when I was young, when we had an IBM PC Junior, there were magical things relative to what you could do a few years prior. So I was always sort of fascinated by technology and the goodness that it could create for people. So I grew up in Colorado, came out here to pursue that. And, in the spirit of kind of being succinct, I meandered a little bit and then ended up at Facebook, helped them figure out what the business model for the company was going to be. And then, fast forward 5 years, I was the president of Pinterest. And about halfway through my time there, I was there about 6 years. I think I started to just notice how much my phone was taking over my life. I started to notice that I didn't really have the kind of control over my phone that, back in sort of when it was just a cell phone or just a BlackBerry, I felt like I had a little bit more control. And I think with the dawn of, the computer now going from the desktop to being in your pocket, the computer becoming so much more powerful. And then, of course, push notifications, no matter what kind of phone you have, and the app ecosystem. I think I just started to really notice just how much it had taken over my life and how I didn't have control. And, that coincided with my wife and I having our first child. This is 6 years ago. And I realized that even though I sort of, in my heart of hearts, I wanted to be this super engaged, super present dad, I noticed that my phone was kind of pulling me in the other direction. So, I'd find myself in a closet or in our pantry, hiding away, doing stuff that, looking at Instagram or looking at, videos on YouTube or but frivolous stuff, stuff that
Right.
wasn't at
Not
all consistent with kind of what the kind of life I wanted to build, and it was clearly taking away from my relationships, and so and just my ability to generally be present with myself and with others. And so that was the beginning of a journey that included, talking quite a bit about this issue at Pinterest. And, I actually keynoted a global advertising conference in about 3 years ago, where I talked about this problem. And as I was sort of preparing that talk and giving that talk, I thought, this is such an important issue for me. I think that I need to think about going off and working on it full time. And so I had an idea of software on the phone that would really help people sort of understand how much they were using it, and coach them, get them to sort of use it less. And as I was researching the area, I found Moment, which was a company that a guy named Kevin Halesh had founded and created, and they had a couple million people already using their product. And so as I was leaving Pinterest, I gave him a call and we started talking and we hit it off. And I decided to buy the company from him. He has continued to stay involved, and we talk very often, and he's still leading the engineering effort. But we moved the company out here to California and have been focused on the screen time efforts of the company. But we're also we're incubating some other things that at some point we may want to talk about, that really go beyond just how do you control how much time you spend on your phone to, are there other ways that we might be able to imagine social media, versus it being kind of this extractive ad business model that just fragments our attention to something that really serves the user, serves your social needs. So
yeah.
hopefully that wasn't too
Thanks.
long-winded.
No, perfect. I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and we're gonna touch on a lot of different topics, but I want to at least begin by framing this dance that I think we're going to do back and forth throughout this podcast between the personal impacts and also personal steps that we can take to mitigate the effects of this technology with
Yeah.
the larger societal impacts, as well as the societal and technical influences that determine our personal usage. Because I think one of the mistakes that is often made in this when people are talking about these technologies and their impacts is the idea that it's just our addiction is just a personal shortcoming or a personal failure, and we neglect to see what influences are behind that, are driving that addiction, and how pervasive they are, how powerful they are, and how really kind of helpless, not entirely helpless, but how they exploit our basic human vulnerabilities. And of course, this is something that the Social Dilemma, I think, pulled the veil back on really well, and talked a lot about how the business model of these technologies is designed to exploit our attention, that our attention is the commodity that's being bought and sold. And I think it's really helpful for people to understand that, because it's empowering and it takes it out of the sense of just, I'm a failure, there's something wrong with me, to, oh, wait, like I'm being actively exploited by very powerful forces. So with that in mind, I want to rewind a little bit and go back to your time at Facebook.
Yeah.
When you were starting to develop the business model for Facebook, which was, earliest, I think at that time, there wasn't really a lot. Facebook was the early player, right, in kind of developing the business model for social media in general. Like, a lot of people followed Facebook's lead in that regard. Is that right? Or would you say there was something that came first that was influential
Well,
in how you were thinking about it?
I think the way that I was thinking about it was, I thought, we didn't say this explicitly, but I thought we were a media company, not unlike Yahoo was a media company, not unlike TV was media, not unlike radio was media, not unlike newspapers was media. And by the way, that the whole history of media has broadly been supported by advertising.
Of course. Yeah.
And we looked at Google, which was sort of this hybrid of media and technology, completely advertising supported, very successful. Yahoo, the same. And so we did look at other avenues, but it just seemed really clear and straightforward. Like, well, this is a nice, clean way for us to make money. And it's how media has built a business for the past 100+ years. What could go wrong?
Right. Because it's not like social media companies were the first to try to get people's attention and profit from attention. I mean, if you take any kind of copywriting course or look at, what newspapers have done for centuries, you look at how headlines are written, they're all designed to get people's attention and to get people to read the story. However, social media, just because of the nature of the technology involved, social media companies have just been far, far more successful at doing that.
Correct. And I think that, I haven't talked about this that extensively, but an interesting use case. Well, if you look at TV and you look at radio, it's basically human curated, right? It's human beings making decisions about programming for humans. There isn't like any omnipotent, all-knowing force that's like, oh, we know what people are really going to like. We've got the math is super clear. But what's interesting, if you look at a Netflix, for instance, there are two forces at play now on Netflix that are starting to make their programming pretty addictive. It's not quite like social media because it's not personalized to Chris, but not only are the algorithms are absolutely personalized. So when you turn on your TV and you look at Netflix, it's showing you sort of a menu of things that are recommended to you based on what you've watched previously. And that can prey on you for sure and extract your attention in ways that maybe you don't understand or that are necessarily aligned with your best interest. But the other thing that they're doing is they're looking at viewership data on past shows and using that to inform the development of new shows. And that hasn't been done at the level of detail and fidelity that they're doing it. And everyone's like, God, this is renaissance of TV. TV is so good and riveting. And I think that's in part because they've figured out ways to harness the creativity of human beings. I sadly also think that is because we really understand, and Netflix and others are starting to really understand, well, this is actually the story arc that will really suck someone in, that can really get someone to binge watch for a long period of time. And that was more of a creative art and speculative exercise 20 years ago. And now it's just becoming, rot science.
Right. And eventually AI will just do the whole thing, right?
Precisely.
Including creating the programming, the digital images and video, and
and
won't even need any people.
It'll probably be personalized in a way that, which is just
we might watch the same show, but it has slightly different ending based on our preferences. Why not? If it's AI that's making it and you don't have actors, you can make essentially unlimited number of twists and endings based on each person's preference.
Yeah, which is just crazy scary. But I think to quickly go back to Facebook, what we didn't understand that, I really clearly understand now is that when you have a media company and you combine a business model that's predicated on getting more and more of the user attention, because user attention, advertising allows you to take user attention and turn it into dollars. If that gets intersected with an all-knowing algorithm that's personalized to every single individual, and it's actually an algorithm that knows you better in many ways than you know yourself, the natural extension of that is just it eventually will take over our lives and take over our society. I mean, I was looking at the data, the usage data for social media. 10 years ago, we spent about 12 and a half minutes a day on social media. That was the usage. Those are usage numbers.
Oh, quaint.
Quaint. That has gone up tenfold. We now spend two and a half hours a day. So 240 minutes a day on average on social media. And that's just getting more and more and more potent. We talk about the opiate crisis, and don't get me wrong, I think the opiate crisis is really scary, but you're not talking about a drug that's getting substantially more addictive each year.
Yeah.
If that were the case.
And it's completely unlicensed and unregulated and not
Absolutely.
until recently not acknowledged as addictive like opiates.
Yes. Yeah.
And opiates are not actively marketed to teenage girls and boys and kids as young as 6 years old, right?
That's right.
All right, so we're going to come back to all that because we're both parents, and I know we both have strong feelings about how these technologies impact kids and teenagers. But so you're at Facebook, you're figuring out the model, advertising, can certainly see why you would have arrived at that conclusion. As you were sitting around the table talking about it, I'm imagining you had absolutely no idea like where we would be, where this would lead to, where we would be today. It seems like it would have been hard to envision the way that this would unfold, just given that we didn't have a reference point for how potent these technologies could become. And then I think also at that time, the algorithms were far less sophisticated, right? Or there weren't really even algorithms that were making the kind of decisions that are being made now by algorithms. I think that's another, to me, X factor that really informs this conversation.
I mean, there was a news feed that people looked at, and it actually was, sometimes this gets misreported. It was always from the very beginning algorithmic. It was not deterministic. It was literally like, okay, Chris, we've got several thousand things we could show you. Let's put them in order of relevance, not time sort them. And that was part of, Mark Zuckerberg's genius, actually, he was the one that sort of figured out like, oh, this is actually more interesting if I can curate this in a way that's personally relevant to Chris. No, it wasn't. I mean, you can retrospective vision is 2020 or whatever the expression is. Like it's so easy now. I think what we didn't understand, well, I'll say what I did not understand is just the pace at which the algorithm was going to improve. And I think we also didn't understand, at the time, it was truly a social network in that the content that we were looking at to show you, Chris, was like, it was pictures of your friends and family and status updates of your friends and family. So, and don't get me wrong, we were still starting to prey on some dimensions of human weakness, right? We were preying on comparison, our vulnerability to comparison, our vulnerability to popularity. So, and that's why it was working, right? We were adding more and more people, but news wasn't on the service in any real way. There weren't groups. There weren't, you were basically like on there with 50 to 100 friends, and you were in your own universe. And this idea of sort of societal level causes and issues and conspiracy theories and all this other stuff. I mean, none of that was on the horizon at all. And so maybe, if I'm just trying to be totally objective, if we had really sat down, and this is what really all companies should do, and we didn't, which is, this game theory, this thing out, what could go wrong for us, obviously, but also what could go wrong for our users. And I think it would have been really hard to predict the societal stuff, but I think we could have predicted the individual harms potentially, right? If we just sat down and said, okay, shoot, so people are going to start learning about parties that they weren't invited to. We knew that was starting to happen, right? People are going to start to see what others are up to. Oh, and because those people know that what they're up to is getting pushed out, that might lead them to distort the quality of what they're up to, the experience. And this could lead to a little bit of a comparison arms race, where it's well, my vacation was better than yours, and my kids are happier than yours, and my marriage is blissful. It's more blissful than yours. None of that's explicit, right? But you could start to see that just happening because of the nature of the service. And I think that's what, if I'm really objective, I think that's what we probably could have realized. But the polarization, the tribalism, the misinformation, the hate speech, all of that would have been really tough to forecast.
And that's, of course, become especially amplified over the last maybe couple of years in particular. And I do want to come back to that as well, because I think that's
well, and I think that it's up to you whether you want to touch on it. I mean, the misinformation and lack of shared truth, we're experiencing that in the last 24, 48 hours.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, this to me is the fundamental theme of the social dilemma. And the reason that I've become more concerned about this than virtually any other societal problem that we face, whether you're talking about climate change or other environmental issues or social justice or any of the kind of existential, societal threats that we face. And the reason for me is that in order to adequately address those threats, we need to have a shared reality as the basis of the conversations that we have around those topics. And if we have no shared reality, discussion and meaningful conversations become impossible. And there's never been a time in human history where we have not had a shared reality. So to me, that, I already had kind of read and thought a lot about that, but the social dilemma just really drove that home in a powerful and frankly terrifying and alarming way. And yeah, we're seeing the impacts of that with the election. We're seeing it leading up to the election, where you have one side of the political spectrum literally has a completely different reality than the other side of the political spectrum. And that makes a conversation where we could find common ground and empathize with each other and be able to work from that shared reality to find, some type of meeting place in the middle, that becomes impossible. So how do we navigate this? I don't think anyone has the answer, but I mean, at least raising the question seems to be the most important first step that we can take, and at least communicating to people that this is the problem that we're facing.
Yeah.
Do we even have a shared reality that there's no shared reality? I mean, not to get too epistemic here, but
no, I think that's a very important question. And I think that was part of the aim of this film and I think in some ways, I'm hopeful that at least maybe temporarily that's what the film achieved with now I think almost 40 million households saw this film.
That's encouraging. I heard that stat and I was really happy. Yeah.
Which is terrific. So that the hope at least, right, was okay, wow, we're all of us are getting effed with. And so all of our realities have distortion fields. Can we each step outside of those and at least see that all of our attention and reality is getting tweaked and manipulated by these algorithms and services? There does seem to be some of that. And I will say, and I don't think this is necessarily a function of the film. I think it's a function of a lot of forces. I am really heartened, and I'm an optimistic person, and sometimes I get criticized for being overly optimistic. So I have to caveat what I'm about to say with that point. I think Facebook has been incredibly negligent in this whole thing, but I am encouraged. I don't think they're doing enough, but they are doing a lot more in the last 6 weeks than they have done in terms of moving from their positions than they've done in the past several years. And what I mean by that is they're now saying Holocaust denial will be taken down or labeled. They basically didn't want that. They weren't going to touch that type of information for years, and Mark defended it under the guise of free speech, and he's moved on that. And that is, I think, a movement towards shared reality. The other thing is it's a pretty big concession, I think, for certainly relative to their original position, for them to post on the top of their news feed, there is no winner to the election. And there's these groups propagating on Facebook about the election being stolen by Democrats with fraudulent counting, and those groups, the distribution of those groups is being capped. And from a policy standpoint, that just wasn't happening on these kinds of issues even 2 months ago at Facebook.
Right. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I mean, I can see both sides of this issue. On the one hand, I can appreciate that, controlling or censoring the presence of obviously false information could contribute to building shared reality. My problem with that, or my fear or concern around that, is who decides what is fraudulent and what is not fraudulent. So let's just take an example in my field. What if Mark Zuckerberg or someone decides that saturated fat is actually the boogeyman that we've always been told that it is, and that low carb and ketogenic diets are fake news or false information, and so they should only allow sharing content that is in alignment with the American Diabetic Association and American Heart Association perspective on diet. And this isn't actually a hypothetical example. I have colleagues.
In holistic medicine, this is a big issue.
No, I have colleagues in the space whose names I won't mention, who had, very prominent presence on Facebook with groups and related to ketogenic diets, and they have basically been shadow banned from Facebook, where they can no longer, advertise or reach their people on Facebook, because someone at Facebook has decided that ketogenic diets are harmful or dangerous or not in alignment with the conventional view. So, and I have a real problem with the idea that some 20-something, 30-something white males, in Silicon Valley are going to be making those decisions. Yeah. So
the irony is that they're probably intermittent fasting and on keto diet.
That's absolutely, that's what's crazy about it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can get behind the kind of, well, I shouldn't say this because I actually don't get behind it, but it's easier to get behind censorship when it's like on your side. If you're like, okay,
I agree,
we're censoring something that I don't believe in, that's great. But when it's not, if to your point earlier, if you think forward and project down the line where this could end up, it's scary. And, I'm curious what you think about this. Like,
well,
people have argued that, like, Facebook and Twitter they're more like public utilities at this point. And because of that, like, there needs to be we need to have a conversation about how these decisions are going to be made, because leaving them to be made just by a handful of tech entrepreneurs is maybe not the best option at this point, given the pervasive influence that they have, not only in the US, but worldwide.
Yeah. I think you bring up a really good point. I think that let's leave aside the shadow banning on Facebook, because it's it's really a problem. But at least from their stated policy, Facebook has up until recently said that basically we're going to allow anyone to say anything, and we're going to and by virtue of just allowing more and more speech on a diverse spectrum, this thing will sort itself out. And I think there's some real merit to that. And I think that certainly the principles of free speech and the principles, particularly of political speech, at least in the origin of what was intended with the right to free speech, was that particularly our leaders or potential leaders could say whatever they wanted. That premise was created in a world in which you had a small number of discrete institutions who were doing the following. If you said the Holocaust isn't real, and you were a leader, and I was a leader or prospective leader, and I said, no, the Holocaust is real, or maybe we should pick something a little less charged. But let's just stick with it.
It's hard. Everything is charged now.
Everything's charged now. Here's what's different today from what was the case when these sort of laws and rights were put into place. What we could count on back then was that these institutions, by and large, would write an article, contextualize it, put in a quote from you, put in a quote from me, explain the context of my view. What is it about, what are the varying views for why someone might deny the Holocaust? And they're sort of a set of factual reasons why someone might come to this view, even though the view isn't factually substantiated. And then a similar sort of alternative, the view of the Holocaust is real, and here are the data that support it. And that is what got distributed out to people.
Right. But here's the other problem in my mind, is that at that time there were no profit maximizing algorithms. So what
Exactly.
was made clear in The Social Dilemma and in many other venues is that part of the reason that America and the world have become so polarized over the past few years is that these algorithms, which had no original intent to do this, their only mission, right, was to maximize the number of clicks, because by doing that, they're going to increase the profit of the advertisers.
Yep.
And the algorithms quickly learned that people clicked more on articles and stories that were more polarized and that were further to the left or further to the right.
Yes.
And so even though if you have this environment that permits free speech,
yes,
people are not seeing the full range of that speech. And in fact,
the polls.
They're seeing the polls, and I think the appreciation of nuance and seeing different sides of an argument has decreased to an all-time low probably in human history because of that. It seems like everything now is either black or white, up or down. There's no capacity for understanding nuance or seeing different sides of an issue, because people have been conditioned almost like Pavlovian dogs to only pay attention to arguments that and I think there's also an evolutionary reason there, like where
absolutely
that the arguments that are black and white are, it's that I'm forgetting the exact psychological term, but it's basically conserving psychological resource, where if we have to spend less mental energy to think about something or figure it out, from an evolutionary perspective, that would have probably benefited us in terms of survival. So we're drawn to arguments that are simple and straightforward, even if they're wrong.
So, Chris, let me ask you, like I would like to definitely talk about the business model, because I think that the film asserts this, and I am generally aligned with the fact the business model is certainly probably at the root of a lot of this. Let's assume that we can solve that just for a second, because I'm curious let's take this ketogenic example, the example of the ketogenic diet. What would be the best in terms of a post that advocated the ketogenic diet? Are you saying that that should be allowed with the qualifiers that, the American Heart Association or these organizations do not endorse this? However, these groups have traditionally been many years behind the leading edge of science. So you're basically, is that the nuance that you want to apply?
That's a good question. I think, I would have to think about it further. My knee-jerk response is, I don't know that we even need that level of qualification, because nobody put those organizations in charge other than themselves, and they were not elected. They were not,
Fair.
nobody decided that those organizations, which take enormous amounts of money from pharmaceutical companies and other companies that have a vested interest in producing certain outcomes. So maybe, I'm getting a little too granular in your particular example, but something I try to do as a writer is to, when I write articles, is to present other points of view, and since you followed my work for a while, you probably know this about me, but I'm not super dogmatic, and I'm not a gung ho keto guy or low carb guy or fasting guy or any guy, because for every person that ketogenic diet helps, because I'm a clinician and I've worked with patients for over a decade, I see firsthand when it doesn't work, and so I have that experience that keeps it real for me, where I'm like, hey, look, this can really help with weight loss for some people with blood sugar issues. It can be a life-changing thing for kids with epilepsy. But guess what? If you're a woman, you're burning the candle at both ends, you're under a lot of stress, and it actually might take you in the wrong direction. So I don't know, Tim, like in that situation, should every article have a sort of box that says this doesn't work for everybody? I mean, I can see that being laborious, and who puts that there? Who decides what that box says? It's tricky. It's really tricky. And I'll just say too, like, I don't have the answers. I've thought about this a lot, and I have opinions, but I imagine you would say the same too, but like, I think we've got a ways to go to figuring these out. I just want to be having these conversations. I think that's
I agree.
vital.
There's just going to news for a moment, because I think these same challenges apply to political news or just general news, right? In terms of bias and leaning, and there actually are some startups that have emerged in the past 6 to 12 months that are really trying to go after, how do we have services that provide neutral and unbiased news, or at least provide the context on various articles. In fact, there's a browser plugin that just came out yesterday, and I will send you the name of it, so in case you put it in the show notes, that basically, as you go across the web and you look at various articles, it shows the bias. So it'll show, this is actually relative to center, this is heavily right-leaning or slightly right-leaning. And then some of the other bias dimensions that I've seen is, because actually right and left is an important spectrum to understand, but there's also establishment versus anti-establishment.
Yeah.
And where does it sit on that spectrum? And so I am imagining...
how evidence-based too.
What'd you say?
So how evidence-based? That would be another spectrum that would be interesting, because
that's what I was thinking for the keto thing, is that look, it's like, what's the evidence? What's the peer review? Was there a double-blind, controlled trial? And then if there are institutions named, there is a disclosure of lobbying dollars, right? Like all of that gets, all of that is knowable information. It exists out there, and it's actually, those are objective facts. And so one of the ways that, I do think technology can't solve everything,
Yeah,
but if I had sort of a truth teller that could follow me around the internet and create transparency around institutional claims and fact assertions and et cetera, that would be pretty useful.
I agree. I think as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking more and more about the business model as a potential solution here because, you know, even with the kind of what you're talking about, the danger is that there's then no room for new ideas that challenge the status quo and the dominant paradigm. Those ideas quickly get squashed and very little attention. I
Yep.
mean, in medicine, I can point to so many
Oh yeah.
examples like of where the status quo was, fervently defended for so many years and
Right.
then turned out to be wrong.
Right.
And,
Right.
like one of the best examples is the idea that ulcers were exclusively caused by stress. And there were these two physicians in Australia who challenged that idea
Yep.
at like a gastroenterology meeting, and they argued that it was actually caused by an infectious organism,
Right.
Helicobacter pylori. They were laughed off the stage
Yep.
literally and completely excommunicated from their field and not taken seriously for years and years. And it wasn't until one of them actually swallowed a vial of this bacteria, infected himself with got developed an ulcer, took antibiotics, which treated got rid of the infection and healed the ulcer. And even then, it was still years before that became widely accepted as, the pathogenesis of ulcer. So in that scenario, if you imagine, I think Warren was one of the guys, if they wrote an article about this theory and then it was fact checked and there was like, wait, there's no studies to support this yet, or there's no this is way on the end of the spectrum of, you know anti-establishment and, not enough science to support it, it doesn't get any attention and it just dies there. So I think you and I are really kind of on the same page here. I'm just playing devil's advocate, not because I don't think that's a valid thing to explore, but just to point out like the other side of it and how that could go wrong,
Well, but the same,
depending on who's in control of that information.
yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion. Like, to me, that technology that I'm imagining would have to have an affordance for outlier emergent views, right? So like I know about this ulcer issue
Hmm.
because there's a similar debate, and you're familiar with it, around back pain, right?
Yep.
Lower back pain, in that
Discs.
is it caused by what's actually going on in the spine or the disc, which is what conventional medicine believes is the case 99.9% of the time, or is there a psychosomatic contributor there? And there's a lot of compelling data and that suggests that a lot of our back pain and back issues are emotional and somatic issues,
Right. Or at least not structural.
or at
There
least
could be
not.
some other, inflammation or something happening. But yeah,
Yes.
you're referring to the study at UCLA where they took people with back pain and without back pain, gave them
Yes.
MRIs and
Yes.
found lots of slip discs and structural problems, but there was no correlation between pain and
Nothing.
structural problems.
Yeah.
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 So let me turn this back around. And so, one of the arguments I've seen or proposals that I've seen is shifting to a system that's not advertising supported, where people are using like cryptocurrency, or, very small amounts of cryptocurrency or something to pay for content that they find to be valuable. Do you think that that is a viable solution, or with algorithms as they are, is that still just going to, continue us along this like echo chamber path where people are just paying, algorithms are presenting same kind of content to people that they already would be inclined to see, and they're just paying for it in a different way? Or is there a way that the algorithms can be removed from that equation in this business model where people are paying for content instead of advertisers paying for it?
I certainly think it's possible that one of the solutions to the advertising-based business model, which I think there is increasingly alignment around that being problematic, that the alternative to that is likely some combination of subscription with, and this gets out of my depth, joined up with a cryptocurrency model whereby that would both enable users to be compensated for information about themselves potentially, and exchanging that on a one-to-one basis with someone who wanted to reach them as a marketer.
Right, and that's entirely by choice.
And that's entirely by choice, and it's opt-in, not opt-out.
Yeah. Right.
I think that I don't have the clear answer. I think the raw materials of the alternative business model that we need to go to are cryptocurrency, some notion of sort of wisdom of crowds, and some notion of a subscription, right? Some notion of the user paying. And I think importantly, one of the principles there is that the service has to be aligned with my interests, my best interest as a human being, which is that I want to live a happy, healthy, and life of liberty. And if the service is not aligned with providing that, then we have a problem. And the issue with the advertising-based business model is that is just fundamentally misaligned. I think one of the more potent things, it's funny, this was on a Netflix earnings call, so it didn't show up in the Netflix film, Social Dilemma. But one of the executives was asked about competition. Who are your competitors, Netflix? And, they wanted him to sort of refer to like Disney Plus or HBO. And he said, oh, we don't worry about that. Our competitors are sleep and your relationships.
That's right.
And
it's amazing that he would just come out and say it that brazenly and transparently.
It was a couple of years ago. I don't think he would have said it today. But that is the starkest example of illustration of the misalignment of incentives, right? Which is, or the misalignment of interests. It's like, my interest is for you to sleep less and have fewer social relationships, because that means more money for me. That is, it's antithetical to what is in your best interest in the medium and long term.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the best test, I think, that you need to run on any business model in terms of understanding, okay, is this going to end up in a bad place? Because if there's a misalignment of interests, we ultimately get in trouble. And that's true of cigarettes,
medicine. It's a huge issue in my field.
Huge issue in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we've got to figure that out. I mean, it's not even the magic wand. It's what I would hope, what I imagine could be a way that we get there practically is, you look at fossil fuels, and you look at the auto manufacturers, and you look at, the awareness that crept in over time with films like The Inconvenient Truth and so forth, that led us to get to some alignment, not complete alignment, that look, fossil fuels were extractive and were not in our medium and long-term best interests. And so it was somewhat adversarial, but the point is that the government put in place both incentives and penalties to get auto manufacturers very slowly to move towards electric, segue from fossil fuels to clean energy. I think, and we got to do this in a lot shorter order than what happened with, or is happening from fossil fuels to clean energy. Ideally, what would happen is Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and Susan Wojcicki who runs YouTube, would get together and say, with heads of government and consumer advocates, and we would have sort of a conference or a convention or a summit, and we don't even have to have expectations around this summit, but it's just like, let's just talk about what's going on. Let's look at the fact. Let's try to see if we can get aligned on facts. Because if we can get aligned on facts, for instance, the misalignment of the business model as an example of a core fact that perhaps there could be alignment on, I would like to believe that maybe there's a way that a path could be co-created out of where we are. And it can be joint responsibility, because it is joint responsibility. We are here because consumers have allowed us to get here as individuals collectively. The governments have done a poor job of regulating across a number of dimensions. And then the companies have operated, I think, with some real negligence. So there's shared responsibility. And so ideally, if there were some reckoning like that, and then this idea that what if we could figure out a way through incentives, through penalties, carrot and stick, to segue into a model that is, the clean energy version of the business for these social media companies. That is kind of the elements that we talked about. And why are we doing this? Because it's existential. We need a Paris, climate summit, and then a Paris Accord.
That's right. It is existential, and I think very few people have recognized that up, prior to the release of Social Dilemma. And I do think that that's really changed things. Just speaking to some people in my life, I know it had a huge impact and really opened their eyes to the extent of the problem and the scale of the problem and how far beyond just personal use of these devices it goes. And I think it is helpful to think about other industries or fields. Like food is an interesting one to consider. Very close parallels between how the manufacturers of processed foods understand very well how to exploit our inherent human vulnerabilities, right? We have this in almost insatiable craving for highly rewarding, calorie dense foods, because that actually protected our survival in a natural environment where food scarcity was a much bigger problem than food abundance, right? And so if we sought out sweet, salty, fatty, calorie dense foods, then we were more likely to survive periods of famine or food scarcity. But then when you've got Costco and 7-Eleven and Walmart everywhere, that's totally backfires on us. And we know that these processed food companies employ neuroscientists who study things like mouthfeel and who then inform the development of those processed food products so that they're maximally addictive. There's you and I are old enough probably to remember the Lay's. I don't know if they even still do this I bet you can't, or Pringles, I bet you can't just eat one. Yeah, they'll win that bet, and they know they'll win that bet because they have a lot of science behind that bet. And so, some of the steps that have been taken in the food industry, and this has been controversial politically, one is the soda tax. Right. So, that's passed in some places. And the idea being like, look, we know that this is not good for us, and we also know that many people just either don't know or can't stop themselves from consuming these products. So the government is stepping in to play a role in protecting human life, just as they did with seatbelts in cars. And of course, you have opinions on that span the political spectrum about what the role of government and whether that should be the role of government. But and then I recently heard that the city of Berkeley was the first municipality in the entire US to regulate what foods can be displayed at the checkout counter. Because I guess they had done studies and found, if you get up to the front of the checkout counter, you see, of course, what do you see? You see candy, chocolate, all kinds of stuff. And people just grab it and throw it in their cart, almost kind of unconsciously. And so those are two examples of, in this case, more penalties or regulation, not so much incentives, but penalties for, at least those local governments in those areas decided that we're in the human, in the protective
yeah,
interest
yeah.
of
You know,
humanity.
and I've certainly heard the paternalistic argument about government and imposing and stepping in. But look, it's the government, the taxpayer, that ultimately is going to have to pay for the 100 million people in the United States that are pre-diabetic or diabetic.
That's right. That's
And
right.
and this issue isn't dissimilar from a standpoint that there clearly are causal links between social media usage and anxiety and depression. And right, anxiety and
Hmm.
depression lead to heart disease.
Yeah. Well,
And
let's talk
even just
about that.
treating anxiety and depression, right, it's incredibly costly.
Yeah, let's use that as a segue to talk a little bit more about the personal impacts and also what steps people can take personally, because I think it's pretty clear that the solution has to be multifaceted. It can't just, no individual is going to overcome this problem on their own. And
No,
so it's probably going to be solutions at the individual level, the family level, the community level, all the way up to maybe even a global consortium,
sure,
like you're
sure.
saying, because this is not a problem that recognizes any borders,
No,
right? So,
no.
and these companies have a multinational influence, and so any solution that's viable is going to have to span all of those
Right.
geographical boundaries. So, and we're not going to solve that today as much as we'd like to,
Yeah.
and so you obviously recognize the value of individual action. That's really what Moment is about, and you came to your own personal realization of how it was impacting you as a person and as a father, and I did as well. And so let's talk first about what we know about how this impacts people and their mental, physical, and I would even say spiritual health. And
Yeah.
then what steps that you're taking on a personal level that you take with your family, and I can share some of what I'm doing and have found to be helpful, because we can't just wait for solutions to be presented
Yeah.
from on high. We got to
Yeah.
take this into our
No,
own hands.
absolutely. Well, the two studies that stick out to me the most, and I can send you those to put in the show notes. One is about that shows the correspondence of increased social media usage in children and the impact on the prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
And it actually shows thinning in the prefrontal cortex corresponding with the volume of social media overuse. That's obviously scary. Prefrontal cortex is, as you know, is executive
Basically, what
function.
makes us human and just differentiates us from other animals on the planet.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And look, I think that, and this is where I'm clearly out of my depth, but at least intuitively, brain changes, negative brain changes when you're a kid are significantly more scary
Yes.
than certainly some of the football data about kids who play contact football between the ages of 10 and 15 and start then. It's a
Yeah.
way worse situation than if it's later on.
Right. Because the brain is still developing and it's very plastic and
Yeah,
for lack of a better term, impressionable at
yeah,
that point.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the second study is one that shows, again, corresponding with the magnitude of social media usage. It shows that the greater the usage over a certain threshold, there is thinning in the gray matter around the amygdala,
Mm. Yep.
not unlike the thinning that you see in cocaine addicts.
Right.
And those are both, as I understand it, peer-reviewed, credible studies. I'll
Yep.
let you be the judge of that, Chris. But I'll send you those, and
Yeah.
you can post those in your show notes if you want. So look, the data is clear. These services in left sort of to their own devices and without us putting in reasonable limits, they make us sick.
Yeah, I would say the deterioration of sleep duration and quality is probably another one of the most alarming health impacts.
Absolutely.
We've got something like 70 or even 80%, I think it is with millennials, of people sleep with their phone either like on their pillow or on their bedside, and it's not their phone in airplane mode, used as an alarm clock. It's their phone on, and they're waking up and responding to texts. And
Yep.
I had Dr. Matthew Walker from Berkeley, who's probably one of the
Yeah.
foremost sleep scientists in the world, on my show. And if you haven't listened to that show, folks who are listening now, please do, because yes, you've heard me talk about the importance of sleep, but listening to him talk about it really drives it home that this is, probably one of the most significant health pandemics that we're facing right now is sleep deprivation, especially, and for the same reason you mentioned, it's even more serious in kids and teens because their brains and bodies are still developing, and the studies are horrifying on kids and how much sleep they need and versus how much they're actually getting, and that's largely due to technology. I mean, one thing that often gets overlooked is just basic physical safety, right? So texting while driving, I think, is the number one cause of death in a certain age group among kids, or at least number two or three. Not kids, but young
Teenagers. Yeah.
teenagers and young people. And when something is the number one or even number two cause of death in a particular age group, you expect to see a
Yep.
lot of discussion, maybe even regulation, legislation. Like it's kind of, think how much you see about heart disease and cancer and some of these causes of death in adults. And so yeah, it's a massive problem. And I'm curious
Chris,
what you.
the other piece of data that I think is really telling and is in the film is the study of on 10 to 14-year-old girls, and
Yeah.
the in the last 10 years the suicide rate within that
Mhm.
cohort in the United States has gone up threefold.
Yes, so
Prior
sad.
to 2010, I think it was on the decline in prior
Yeah.
decades. And then hospitalizations from self-harm in
Mhm.
that same period went up 4 or 5-fold.
And I would say this is harder to quantify. I know some studies have tried, but just self-confidence, self-worth, feelings of fitting in your own skin, and
Yep.
of if you're a teenage girl and you're posting a photo on Instagram, and this was really well done in the film, um,
Yeah.
and you get only a handful of likes. What does that do for your self-esteem? Then you're spending your whole time thinking about how you can change your appearance. Like in the case of the film, she's, the girl's changing her expression and doing the sort of pouty lips, and it completely affects how young people and everybody are, their sense of who they are. And I think that's, to me, one of the most dangerous and most scary parts of this, both just as a human and also as a
Yep.
parent of
Yep.
now a 9-year-old girl. So let's talk. I mean, I think most of certainly of my listeners, people who are listening to this podcast, they've heard me talk about this a lot. And so I don't think we're kind of preaching to the choir here, at least in terms of establishing that this is potentially harmful. So let's talk a little bit about, when you had your wake up personally, how did you shift your use of these technologies? Like, what kind of backstops did you put in place?
Mhm.
And now as a parent, how are you thinking about it? Because I have a presentation that I give on technology addiction, and I always start it by saying, what's the dirty little secret of Silicon Valley? All of those guys and women send their kids to Waldorf schools, which don't allow the use of technology. And
Yeah.
when we were in the Bay Area, our daughter did go to a Waldorf school. She was either homeschooled or went to a Waldorf school. So I'm, very much relate to that. So what do they know that everybody else doesn't? And then that leads to an interesting conversation about how can we protect our kids from these technologies?
Well, I'll say that individually, the honest answer is I still struggle, and I think about this problem all the time, and I'm working on it, you know, all day long. And I still have challenges around, keeping my usage to a level that I'm okay with and doesn't have a negative cognitive or psychological effect. The things that have been the most helpful for me, I would say, are, I classify them in kind of the hard limits bucket. I think my issue with the setup of screen time and the Android service is that they don't allow you to set hard limits. They allow you to dismiss kind of anything you've imposed on yourself at will. And that is that is problematic. I use the metaphor of someone who's addicted to cigarettes and saying, "Hey, here's some Scotch tape. Why don't you just put a piece of tape on that box of cigarettes and or pack of cigarettes? That'll help. That'll help you not smoke that next cigarette." So what does that get to? That gets to, and you're familiar with this with food and dieting. And I battle sugar addiction. The solve there, if you look at the research, the solve that's kind of tried and true is you got to get it out of your house or your apartment. You got to create friction between the impulse to eat the sugar and then your ability to actually get it, put it in your hand and put it in your mouth. And getting it out of the house is a tried and true and very effective strategy that often gets bucketed as pre-commitment. Right? How do you pre-commit to something and then kind of throw away the key? So one thing that is actually in the film, and the reason it's in the film is that I told the filmmaker about it, and actually we were gonna add it about sort of my story, and then they decided, which I think was right, was to put the kitchen safe in the fictional story in the film. What is the kitchen safe? It's a plastic box that a plastic safe with a timer on it that has no back door. And it was originally designed, the reason it's called the kitchen safe is originally designed for dieting, for people who wanted to put muffins or sweets in something. And the timer can go as long as several days if you're trying to really create discipline. And so I basically have used that because, I can come home from work and put my phone in this safe and say, you know what, I don't want to touch this thing for 3 hours no matter what. And so I set the safe to 3 hours, I press start, and I can't take it out. And I do think that in terms of psychological well-being, it's fundamental to take, to fast, if you will, right? Yeah. Take sabbaticals, fast on your phone. A more recent hack that I love that you actually can do with screen time on iOS, and there's a similar setting on Android. It's slightly convoluted, but I can explain it in 30 seconds. You go into screen time, you select the apps that you want to have on kind of your fasting phone, right? And so in my case, that's like text messaging, phone, weather, and calendar.
Yep.
And then you go into downtime and you set downtime basically to the amount of time that you want your phone to not be that functional except for those apps. And mine is set from 3 p.m. in the afternoon until 7 a.m. the next morning. That's an aggressive window, but it's what I wanted to try to do. And then you reset your screen time password, and you go to the reset screen time password, and then you hand it to your partner, your wife, or your kid, and they have to set the password, and then you don't know it. And so that is another way. That's a way of using screen time to set hard limits, and you set hard limits by throwing away the key. And those are, if you're really serious as an individual and you really want to take time away from your phone, that is one of the best ways. The third way, and full disclosure, I'm an investor in this company, is there are people who have second phones. And people use that with the Apple Watch, right? They'll just walk around with a watch and leave their phone at home if they have cellular connectivity on their watch. There's also a company called the Light Phone. They make a credit card size phone. It's just a phone along with text messaging. They've added podcasts. They're going to add, ride sharing. And it really can operate as your auxiliary phone. Some people have it as their primary phone, but you can toggle back and forth. And that's also a really nice way of throwing away the key in a sense, because you can really leave your phone at home or leave it in a drawer or put it in the kitchen safe and then just have your light phone.
Yeah, those are all fantastic strategies. I use some version of each of them. I think another one that's been really helpful for me is doing regular digital detoxes where I have a dedicated period where I'm not with my phone at all. And so I do, Sundays is our tech-free day for us entirely. So
Awesome.
we do one every week, and then I do regular, longer periods ranging from 2 to 3 days to 2 weeks throughout the year. And for me, those are really powerful because they, many of us have a hard time even remembering what human experience is like unmediated by a smartphone or
What do
device.
you notice at the end of, a 2 week fast or sabbatical or a 2 to 3 day? Like what
Yeah.
when you get done with it, what's happening?
The most common experience is a sense of dread, honestly.
Right.
um, to come back, people often say, "Isn't that really hard?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's really hard to come back to the kind of relationship that I have with my phone, even though I, like you, sometimes still struggle. I have, on a spectrum of, phone addiction and phone use. I'm pretty far along, or my use is pretty minimal and pretty controlled and pretty tightly regulated.
Yeah.
But still, even with that, I still like resent the ways that it affects me, and I still struggle with it. Like I'm actually right now doing a kind of tune up where I will periodically revisit, my sort of my protocols, and I'm doing Catherine Price's workbook,
Yeah.
how to break up with your phone.
Terrific workbook.
Great course and great workbook. So I'm going through, it's a 30-day program, and I'm going through and just journaling and, making observations about everything. But yeah, so for me, because I've done those so many times, usually it's only like a couple hours adjustment period or maybe a half day where I'm like twitching, kind of, I don't have my phone. And
Hmm.
then after that, I really settle in and remember and appreciate what it's like just to be in the world without a phone. And often on those detoxes, I'm outside of my normal, but not always, I'm outside of my normal environment. So I might be on
Yeah.
vacation, or I might be in a kind of retreat like setting or something like that, which makes it a little bit easier. And I think, especially for your first detoxes, I recommend that people do that. You know, I know that there are actually trips now and companies that will take, like, they're advertising these digital detoxes
Check your
where
phones.
exactly. They take, you check your phone in, they put it in a lockbox, and they don't let you have it during, at any point during the trip. And I think that's the right direction. Like some people are happy to pay for that because they know themselves. If they
Yeah.
have access to it while they're on vacation, they'll pull it out and they'll use it.
Yeah.
So that's been a big deal for me. Another one, which you kind of solved the issue with if you put your phone in like minimal mode already, but if you're not going to do that, is notifications, of course. So
Of course. Yeah.
turning off, I just like, I have very similar to your kind of minimal mode. I have phone, text message notifications, and I think that's even gray area. Like I'm old enough that, like, most of the texts I get are just pretty, like, important, like, "Hey, I'll meet you here at this time," or, I most of my friends are not just, like, texting on these long threads endlessly
Sure.
all day long. And then I have calendar and reminders of certain, like meetings or events or things like that, and that's basically it, for notifications. And I find that just not being constantly interrupted. I sometimes will refer to the phone as the interruption device. If I'm working or I'm paying with my daughter, you know,
Yep.
out having fun, mountain biking, skiing, whatever it is, do I really want to be interrupted by something that somebody posted on Instagram or Twitter, or
Right.
an email that I got that's from Amazon that's confirming something that I bought, or even from anybody, So it's like, yeah. So I think that's been really helpful for me also on a personal level.
Yeah. One of the things that I'll share, which transitions us a little bit to, what do you do with your kids and your family is, we hosted a bunch of, actually both sides of my wife, people from my wife's family, but also my parents' family. This is pre-pandemic. So there were about 12 of us in this house for Christmas. And we just set up a norm, which was that, look, we're not going to turn off the Wi-Fi. We're not going to turn on a cell phone jammer, which actually I do have one from China that I ordered that sometimes I threaten to turn on. But look, we didn't do that. But what we did do is say, look, in the common space, which is basically just like where we eat and cook and hang out, there are no devices here for the whole time. So if you want to go use your device, no problem, but just go in your bedroom or go to a different part of the house. For the common space that we share, there aren't devices. And that has a pretty material change in terms of the tenor and behavior, because it's contagious when when one person picks up their phone and starts looking, everybody else gets twitchy and they grab their phones. And pretty soon, and this is actually what prompted us to set up this norm, I would find myself with my family sitting around the table and all of us were on our phones. And that's a sad state.
Yeah, I like that. We do that too. And this is definitely on the realm of kind of family boundaries. So there's no phone at the meal table, and we eat most of our meals at home, and we eat together, and also no phones in the bedroom, for my wife and I. And I like the idea of extending that even to the living room and common area, and just having kind of, I've seen some people advocate like, the phone stays in kind of like a parking spot somewhere in the home, where you charge it, you set up a charging station that's in a dedicated area. And then you have to willingly, consciously go over and use your phone, so yeah. And then, with kids, what we've decided is a lot of people will think is draconian and, maybe just totally over the top. But we've basically decided that our daughter, who's 9 now, she definitely doesn't have a phone, and she's not going to have access to a phone, and certainly not one that has, social media or anything until she's 15 or 16. And she knows that. We've talked to her a lot about it and about the reasons behind that. She doesn't like it, like any other kid who sees these devices that beep and flash, and, they're totally susceptible to the same things. And of course, she has even friends now that have some friends that have their own phones or an iPad or something like that. And like every other human or kid, she wants what she can't have. And yet at the same time, she actually, when people ask her why she doesn't have a phone, it's really interesting to hear her articulate the response. And she really does get it and she gets it even through the small experience of screen, for screen time for her. Again, we limit to 1 hour a day, and that's really just for listening to audiobooks. It's not really doing anything it's not really screen time. It's like we have a family movie night. So we sit down together as a family on Saturday nights, and we watch a movie together that she gets to pick. So as you can imagine, I've seen pretty much every Disney and other kids movie that you can imagine. We've seen some other movies, but for us that felt good because it's a family experience. It's a time that we get together and enjoy it together, and she knows when to expect it. It's something she looks forward to. She gets ice cream that night, which is not something that typically happens in our house on any other night. And so it's become a bit of like a ritual and a thing that she looks forward to. So yeah, I mean, that's where we landed. And again, I know that that's pretty draconian for some folks, and they're not going to vibe with that. I'm curious what you've decided in your family, and how you came to that decision.
Well, my girls are young. They're 4 and 6, so I haven't hit the hard times at all. I mean, I will share that even at that age, my wife and I did a little bit of trial and error with just time on the iPad, like in cars, like on longer
Yeah.
drives. And
Yeah.
what we concluded was that, obviously, if we gave them both iPads to watch shows when we were driving for an hour or two, the drive was much more pleasant
Right.
and a lot less work.
Yeah.
But then when we got to wherever we were going, the kids were monsters.
Yeah. You got to deal with the fallout
You got
of
to deal
that.
with the fallout.
Mhm.
So what we, through trial and error, decided was it was better and easier to establish a new norm, which is that we weren't going to do that. And so we listened to, there are these stories that there's a podcast called Reading Bug that reads and makes up amazing stories, and we listen to those. And they're educational and useful, and the kids like that. And it doesn't feel fundamentally that different to them, but it's very interesting cognitively because they're still having to use their imagination.
Yeah.
Right. That by virtue of that, they just behaviorally and cognitively, when we get out of the car, they're fine. They're acting normal. So that's one thing that we've learned over time, and we try to persist that as a norm. And it's true on, not that we're flying anywhere lately, but pre-pandemic, that's what we on planes, we just had them color or draw, or for the same reason. It's not because we're it's just net easier over the span of like a 24-hour period.
Absolutely.
And then I think what we will try to do is this wait till 8th pledge. That's kind of this nationwide framework where you can try to get, your kids, all your kids' peers in their class, their parents, to all agree, hey, we're not going to give our kid, it doesn't say anything about any kind of phone. It said, we're not going to give our kids smartphones.
Right.
That probably needs to be revised, because really what I think the most harmful thing is just social media. And it doesn't really matter whether it's on desktop, tablet, or phone. It's like, let's not give our kids these accounts until this date. You want to give your kid an iPhone without that account, have at it. So that's what I would like to do, is try to get alignment. This is a really tough issue, and you are already struggling with it with your 9-year-old, and by the time she's 13, 14, 15, it's going to be really painful, because they have these virtual social lives that live and breathe on these services that they are excluded from.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that, because
somebody's got to solve that. And I tend to believe that there is, one potential solve is that there's just someone creates a parallel service that's super private and has norms and rules on it. At least there's just some alternative thing that the school has administrative control over, the parents have some control over, there's complete visibility on it. I think something like that needs to get created, because
I agree.
The alternative of just nothing makes it really difficult to kind of bridge this world of because otherwise you get a bifurcated situation of basically the parents, often parents who have 5 kids or 4 kids, their youngest, they're just like, look, we give up. They can do whatever they want. And your daughter's in class with that, their youngest, then their youngest is going nuts. And you guys as parents can't totally get aligned, and there's got to be some middle ground that gets created, I think, to help solve this.
Yeah, I think for most people that's going to be a big issue. For us, it's a little bit less so, because we have non-traditionally educated our daughter. She's mostly been homeschooled. She went to Waldorf for a couple of years, and now she's doing a very non-traditional program that is kind of loosely Montessori based, but has like horses and skiing involved. And and so
crazy out. That's amazing for her. It is not. It's just the total outlier.
yeah, it's not practical for most people to be able to do that. And I recognize, it's not like I'm sitting here saying, oh, just do this with your kid. Like,
Yeah,
that's obviously not
it's
going to
the
work
horses.
for most people. I mean, and in our case, it does make it easier because the people who are drawn to those kinds of things and the kids that she's hanging out with tend to be from families that have similar values around this stuff.
Yeah,
So for example, we went on a trip. One of her best friends came with us. We were down in Moab and Arches and Canyonlands and mountain bike, and her friend, her parents feel exactly the same way that we do about technology. So we don't have to deal with this dynamic where her friends bring in her phone and Sylvie's looking at her friend using her phone the whole time. Like that would just not work at all. But I think what you said is really true, and I mean, the other thing that's also true is, and this is the way that we've approached food with her, is like, we don't want to be so restrictive that she doesn't learn to develop her own boundaries around these things.
of
And,
course.
at some point she's going to have to go out into the world. She's
Yeah,
going to get her own phone and she's going to have to know how to deal with these things. And so, we're talking about that and how we can approach that as she gets older. My
yeah,
feeling is still that at her age, it's not a fair fight.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not something that I want to even a burden that I even want to put on her at this point. But certainly as she gets to be older, then we'll continue to explore how we can help her to develop her own healthy relationship with technology that just comes from her own understanding of and
yeah.
experience of how it affects her. But we kind of feel like the stronger foundation she has in just her own development without that, the easier it will be for her to set those limits herself when she gets to that point.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. You can't over shelter. So it's just it's such a tricky balance for parents. But ultimately, but I do think that, especially early on, one of the best things that we can do is protect their cognitive development, so then
Exactly.
they can exercise good judgment later.
Yeah. And
And so that, I don't know exactly what those age ranges are, but I do think that, being a little bit draconian, especially early on, I think pays dividends in terms of them being able to
absolutely.
exercise their own judgment.
And even again, even from a kind of spiritual sense of, and this isn't necessarily spiritual in the way that people would use the term, but just being able to be in your own skin without continuous input or distraction coming from a device is a fundamental skill or capacity that all humans in the
Yeah,
history of time developed, right? We are largely like our generation, and now the subsequent generations are the first generations that could ever possibly go through their entire childhood and even adult life without developing that capacity. And so for me, like, creating lots of time and space for her to just experience being herself in her body without the interference of those devices is probably the most important thing that we're
sure.
trying to give to her as a
Yeah.
child. All right, so I'm so appreciative of your time. I know we're going to wrap it up here quickly. I'm going to pivot again and ask you some more perhaps philosophical questions that
Okay.
you may not have the answers to
Okay.
here. But so what what do you wish you knew, 5-10 years ago about this, all of this stuff that's very clear to you now? And with this question, I'm kind of aiming this towards maybe some folks who are listening who haven't seen The Social Dilemma or who are just haven't thought about this stuff quite as much. What is something that has fundamentally changed your outlook on all of this that you weren't aware of, 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, I think, why don't I just for a moment zero out of even big tech? I
Yeah.
think what I didn't understand 10, 15 years ago was that if you look at the consumer products or services that have been the most wildly successful and profitable over the last several decades, they prey on human weakness.
Right.
Right? That is what Coca-Cola is. That's what
Yep.
McDonald's is. That's what tobacco is. And those are really good businesses, because a lot of the business cost is about me acquiring you as a customer. And another big part of running a normal business that doesn't prey on human weaknesses, I got to pay to keep you around. When we prey on human weakness, it's pretty easy to get you to come over and be my customer. And it's pretty easy to have you stick around. And what that translates into are just these wildly profitable businesses. Mm-hmm. And so I think you always need to be skeptical of any business that's just sort of wildly profitable, because it means that something, and I'm not trying to be a total anti-capitalist, but I do think that wildly profitable businesses often have distorted something in terms of their approach to the customer or how they're delivering the service.
Yeah, it's an addiction-based business model.
It's an addiction-based business model, and that, I think, so, Mark Benioff, the founder and CEO of Salesforce, is just someone who I really admire, and he has begun to talk more and more about a slightly different version of capitalism that companies need to start to practice, which is what he calls stakeholder capitalism, which is there are multiple stakeholders in this equation. And in the case of Facebook or other social media services, there's the advertiser, they're a stakeholder, they pay us. There's the company, that's us. We have employees, owners, if you will. And then they're the users and the consumers. And we have a responsibility to all of these stakeholders. Yeah. We can't make our stakeholders sick. We can't make our stakeholders' lives worse. Yeah. Given that they, after using our product. So I
like that a lot. I just want to interject here. Like that's a plain language way of saying, have you heard of eudaimonics?
I have.
This concept of eudaimonia, which is a Greek word that means human flourishing or prosperity. And an economist named Umair Haque, I think, or Hake, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He created a framework called eudaimonics, which, unlike traditional capitalism, doesn't just focus on the single goal of profitability. It optimizes for 5 different ends, which one is the ratio of an organization's well-being to its income. So the second is how much real human wealth an organization is creating. So not just financial wealth, but actual real human wealth, which considers what he calls ILF, which is the opposite of wealth, right? So subtracting deterioration of capital, air pollution, poisoned water, et cetera, right?
Great.
The third thing is how much human possibility an organization is realizing, which is the ratio of well-being to the highest possible, the realized well-being to the highest potential well-being that you could get to. And then 4 is the organization's net effect on well-being, and 5 is the organization's equality of well-being, like who has access to what the organization is producing. So very similar kind of framework that we've tried to adopt there.
Yeah. I mean, this is an interesting sidebar where we're spending most of our time at the moment is actually on developing a new set of services. And what they're actually really aimed at is the following premise. We've never been more connected in the history of humanity. And yet the research really suggests that we probably never felt more lonely. And that's pretty upside down. And so one of the things that we're spending a lot of time on, and we've prototyped 5 different services, and we're kind of playing with all of them right now, is what if the objective function at the beginning of social media weren't, how do I get Chris connected to as many people as possible and spending as many hours as possible on the service, but instead was, how do I look after Chris's social well-being and social health? Okay, what would I build? Well, you know what you'd build? We think we build you a service that would connect you to the 5 or 10 people that matter most. And we would facilitate an exchange and self-disclosure with those people to create and sustain closeness. we don't know exactly what the shape and size of that service looks like, but look, loneliness is getting epidemic. And
Yeah.
so this is sort of all to say that we just fundamentally believe in 3 to 5 years, there's going to be a service that you use that you probably pay for that looks after and supports your social health. It's interesting, like, you know, the middle and upper class Americans, we spend all this time thinking about all these individual pursuits, like, oh, I got to sleep more, definitely important. I got to be mindful. I got to go meditate by myself. And I've got to go get on my Peloton by myself. I've got to do all these things in the name of health. And you're familiar with this. There's great research that shows that probably the biggest lever for my health and well-being and longevity is the quality of my relationships.
Yeah.
But we leave that, we're the least deliberate about that part of our lives.
Yeah.
So how do you square that? And I think that's an interesting opportunity, one that we're spending a bunch of time on, because we think the world needs it.
Well, we'll have you back on the show when you're ready to talk more about that.
Yeah.
So next question, what keeps you up at night? What are you most concerned about? You know, whether it's the existential impact of these technologies, your family, your daughters, and how it's going to affect, you know, what's most concerning to you about all of this?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a family orientation, which is what world will my daughters come of age in and grow up in, and what does that mean for the life that they're going to be able to lead? You know, and I was sincere in the film when they asked me what I was worried about, and I said, well, I'm worried about civil war.
Yeah. That
is what happens when there's not shared truth with a capital T. And we are in that reality. And as far as I can tell, it's getting worse, not better. So that's what I worry about. And I try to think about ways, and you and I brainstormed about it a little bit, like what is the situation? What are the instruments and services that can get us back to, and dialogue, right? That can get us back to some shared sense of truth, capital T. But the erosion of that is incredibly concerning to me. And, you know, as we talked about at the beginning, I just think this issue of sort of unchecked AI, which is really kind of at the root of this social media issue, it is existential. And I think that I worry a little bit that the world doesn't quite understand that how existential it is relative to something like climate change, which is also existential and also very, very serious, but you can't ignore, we got to go after both.
Yeah. Because as we said, you know, if you don't have a common shared reality, you can't even have conversations about it. And that's where it's at now. It feels like it's stalled because you have two different sides of the issue thinking that the reality is very different. So it doesn't really open up any opportunity for compromise or meeting in places that would lead to real solutions. Yeah, I share that concern, and I think it you know, if we don't get a handle on it quickly, it could rapidly accelerate because of new technologies like deepfakes that are coming in our lifetime and probably in the next decade, where, you know, you imagine a world where you can watch a video or listen to an audio recording or look at a picture and have no idea of its fidelity. You know, you could, anyone can be made to say and do anything on video that's made by AI. And that's just such a short circuit to our human brains. Like, you know, we are not equipped for living in a world like that. And so, you know, it reminds me, Stuart Russell, AI pioneer at UC Berkeley, and he literally wrote the textbook on AI that most people have, you know, students who studied it read. He likes to say that, you know, most people, when they think of the danger of AI, think of like Terminator, you know, and like cyborgs or androids that are run amok or, you know, take over society. But the real risk is, and the much more likely risk is actually the one that's already here, where you have AI that has influenced the outcomes of elections and that has completely fragmented our society, and that could really, I mean, if we think about fake news now, like what happens when, like I said, video is, you know, fake video is indistinguishable from real video. So All right, so we're in agreement on that. That's definitely one of the things that keeps me up at night. What is one thing that gives you hope that, I mean, you alluded to that earlier, but in the face of all of these threats and challenges that we're dealing with as a society and as individuals, what's something that has given you hope?
Well, I alluded to this earlier, and I don't want to let Facebook off the hook. They're 100% negligent for a lot of this mess, but their movement on a bunch of issues in the last several weeks has given me a little bit of hope that they're willing to, they really previously were not acknowledging that hate groups,
Mm-hmm.
if they were just about hating a certain group of people, but weren't explicitly calling for violence, they were allowing it. And now they've really acknowledged, which is so effing obvious, that hate group in and of itself incites violence. And so those need to be looked at and dealt with in a way that where the objective function is we're trying to minimize violence and hate
Yeah.
crimes and all the
Yeah.
downstream things. So that gives me a little bit of hope. I think the success of the film gives me some hope. Like there is
Mm-hmm.
appetite to learn about this and come to a shared understanding about what is happening underneath our feet. So that gives me a little bit. I was very surprised. I thought that the film would have, a decent audience. Look, it came out right before the election, and we
Right.
got a lot of other things to think about besides
Yeah.
this. But I think what happened is people realized that, oh my gosh, like some of the stuff we're dealing with, this divergence of facts on COVID, racial division, a lot of the root cause of some of these, or at least the accelerant of these, is grounded in AI and social media. So
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that that initial message seems to have taken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and seems to span the political spectrum, and
It does. It does
it's
seem
not.
bipartisan.
Yeah, so it's encouraging to me that there's growing conversation around these issues, growing right, and I think this has been true for a long time, that most people, if you ask them, like, has the quality of your life and the quality of your friendships, the quality of your conversations with other people, has all of that improved over the last few years or gotten worse? And I think most people would answer that that's gotten worse, that they are dissatisfied with the quality of public discussion around the challenges and social, political, economic issues that we face. They realize in some way that we're moving backwards as a society, as a species, and that, for me, like, the human ingenuity that got us into this mess in the first place is hopefully what will get us out of it as
So
well. Once our attention shifts in that direction, and that's really what I think it's about, is
I agree.
if it depends on what we're paying attention to, and if we start paying more attention to the harms that these technologies are causing, then I have pretty solid trust and belief that with when we put our attention in that direction, then we'll come up with some good solutions. But the first step is the awareness, and I'm grateful for folks like you and all the others, Tristan Harris and all the others that were involved with the film, for really raising the alarm here and helping to seed more attention and awareness on this issue, because I think I really, really do believe it's certainly one of the, if not the fundamental
Yeah, yeah.
challenge that we're facing as a species of our time.
Well, thank you. I've noticed, a few years ago you were vocal on this topic, and I think that's important. I think it's terrific that people are hopefully factoring their phone usage and social media usage into their assessment of their overall health and well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's goes without saying for the listeners now, but the reason I'm talking about it more is because, yeah, you could have your diet totally dialed in. You could be
Yeah,
doing intermittent fasting and high intensity, strength training, and you're checking every box there. But if you are addicted to your phone and you have have a really unhealthy relationship with that technology, you're not going to be healthy in the way that I understand health. And so it quickly kind of became the elephant in the room in a lot of the conversations I was having with patients and just the, the work that I was doing with folks. So Tim, thank you so much for
Thank
spending
you,
all this
Chris.
time with us.
Yeah,
And yeah, I would love to have you back on when that sounded really interesting, what you're talking about, some of the
yeah.
new stuff
I'll
that you're
keep you
working
posted
on.
for sure.
Yeah,
I'd love to come back on and talk about it.
great.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please keep sending your questions in to chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.